I'd like to bring your attention to the San Angelo NAACP Buffalo Soldiers Memorial Project and its important role in commemorating San Angelo's Buffalo Soldiers and African American community. Beginning last year, a grassroots effort led by the San Angelo NAACP Unit 6219 chapter began to raise funds for the construction of a permanent memorial on a mostly vacant lot on Oak Street right across from Fort Concho. So this $500,000 project will break ground in the coming weeks and should open this summer. But donations can still be made, and if you're interested in learning more information about it, the QR code is up there, and I have some free posters. Please take a free poster because I made too many of them there on the back tables. So have a brownie and a poster. You can't go wrong. And then they're still, even though they've raised most of the money, they still gladly accept any donations. So the QR code will give you more information about that. So, all right. That's pretty much all I have, so I'm going to turn this over to Miss Diana J. Daniels, who is a major in security studies and a member of the student chapter of the NAACP, and she will introduce Dr. Langellier. So, Diana, come on up.
Hello, everybody. So to begin, John P. Langellier obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in history and historical archaeology from the University of San Diego. He earned his PhD in military history from the Kansas State University. Subsequently, he spent nearly half a century in public history. His career included a dozen years with the Department of the Army, variously as a museum director or a command historian, including postings at the Presidio of San Francisco, 21st Support Command, U.S. Army Europe, where he received the U.S. Army Commander's Award, and the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Further, he served with the U.S. Navy Civil Engineer Corps as Director of CEC and CB museums with oversight of facilities in both Port Hueneme, California, and Gulfport, Mississippi. Outside of assignments with the Department of Defense, Dr. Langellier was director of the Wyoming State Museum Historical Research Center and quarterly journal editor, headed the research center of the Autry National Center of the American West, performed as deputy director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, where, among other assignments, he acted as a liaison officer to the military district of Washington for President Reagan's funeral services in California, served as executive director of Charlotte Hall Museum in Prescott, and assumed duties as the Central Division Director of the Arizona Historical Society in Tempe. He has received numerous honors, served on many boards, assisted several organizations in a technical capacity, and provided outside consulting to films such as Apocalypse Now and Geronimo, an American Legend, along with numerous television documentaries. Moreover, the U.S. Postal Service selected him as the historian for the Buffalo Soldier stamp portfolio. From 2020 through 2022, he served as the principal investigator for a congressionally mandated study on the Buffalo Soldiers and the national parks. He is now engaged as a historian with the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, leading groups to historic military sites and museums in the American West. Dr. Langellier has written scores of articles and dozens of books. His most recent titles are Military Outposts of Southern Arizona, Fighting for Uncle Sam, Buffalo Soldiers in the Frontier Army, Scouting with the Buffalo Soldiers, Lieutenant Paul Tan Clark, Frederick Remington, and the 10th Cavalry in the Southwest, and a new book slated for release this year, More Work Than Glory, The Buffalo Soldiers in the United States, 1866 to 1916. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Langellier.
Diane gets a hall pass tonight. She has another meeting to go to, and I offered to go with her, but Jason refused to deliver my talk for me, so you're stuck with me rather than a polished speaker. So she's not running out for anything I said, I hope. So if you need to sneak out sooner than later. And we've all heard of, over the last several years, of fake news. Well, this is fake history. I gave you a title that is somewhat true, but not totally true, and you'll find out why later on. Much of the story that is the hub or the core of what I'm speaking on tonight is fairly well known to any of you people who've been in Texas for some time. Indeed, the first publication that came out on the Llano Estacado, the State Plains debacle, if you will, was printed at Fort Davis just months after the event by a surgeon in the Department of Texas. And interestingly enough, of course, as a surgeon, he's looking at some of the physical effects of that expedition, but he also was looking at some of the psychological effects. And of course, in a day when we're aware of PTSD and are really looking at other effects besides external wounds, that was quite a pioneering effort. And so one of the things that people don't know about our military is some of our surgeons were in advance of our time, whether they were at Fort Concho or many other places. And so some of our best topics can be explored through some of the medical records. But having said that, my talk tonight has to do with Concho as a hub off of this event, along with several other aspects. And it has to do with the fact that, of course, African Americans have been involved in U.S. military operations since the time of the Revolution, and indeed prior to that time. And so even into the 17th century, there were troops serving within the American Revolution from places like Rhode Island, where they were in regiments sometimes, and units that were sometimes segregated with white officers, and sometimes what we would call integrated units. They continued to have a place in our military, but more and more after the American Revolution, which many of the black troops failed to receive the dignity and the equality that they were supposedly the Declaration of Independence was guaranteeing to the nations. It was truly for a white male-oriented documentation or document, and certainly a white male-oriented army at that time. So in the War of 1812, except for a fairly substantial number of naval personnel, and the Navy was integrated all the way up, ironically, through the Great White Fleet for the most part. So the emphasis on white was the, I think, term rather than the Great White. At any rate, the Navy had a number of TARs involved. Indeed, some of the reasons for the War of 1812 was essentially the kidnapping of our sailors at sea, including blacks who were either impressed or put into prison by the British. During the American War with Mexico, there were very few blacks involved, mostly, once again, in the Navy. Some of the men were in the U.S. forces, but once again, usually volunteer units. It's not really until the American Civil War that Lincoln's administration finally, for political and also very practical reasons, will allow blacks to join what were called at the time the USCT, the U.S. Colored Troops. The USCT eventually would have approximately 180,000 black soldiers. So to assume that our friend Mr. Lincoln, by a stroke of the pen, emancipated them is pure balderdash. They fought for that freedom. No one gave it to them. They fought for the ballot box with the bayonet. At the end of the war, the radical Republicans did some extraordinary things during Reconstruction. And many promises of Reconstruction, like the Freedmen's Bureau, unfortunately were short-lived. However, the longest part of that experiment for the post-Civil War period was the U.S. Army. In 1866, Congress got something right. Put this in your diary, because maybe they'll turn around and do the same thing again someday. But at any rate, Congress authorized for the first time African Americans to serve in the U.S. Army. Prior to that time, blacks were banned from service in the standing army itself. And as a consequence, 6 regiments were formed, 4 of infantry, the 38th through the 41st Infantry, and 2 of cavalry, the 9th and 10th Cavalry. And so these regiments would often be comprised of a combination of newly freed enslaved individuals and a goodly number of these veterans who had tasted the military during the war, had tasted the dignity of being their own person as opposed to chattel, and had become part of the military forces. Because of the situation at this time, the Army was kept relatively robust. It went from 1 million men at its peak in the Union forces to about 60,000 during this 1866 act. But you know, Congress, in 1869, they figured, well, 60,000 is pretty good, but maybe 20 or 25 is better. We can save some money. And so the Army is compressed at this time, partially because a lot of the troops that were necessary were here in Texas because of what many of you know, Maximiliano and the French incursion into Mexico, the rebellion against the French by Juarez and others. And so once the French had been expelled, the need for large masses of troops on the Texas border, in theory, were no longer necessary. Not true, but again, Congress didn't worry about that. And so they consolidated what had been 44 regiments of infantry down to 25, and so they compressed 2 of those units of the 38th and the 41st into 1 unit, the 24th, and they did the same thing with the other 2, so they now only had the 24th and 25th Infantry. Once again, all black enlisted personnel, but all white officers' corps. So step in. The Army is now consolidated. They know what their mission is. Some of these men are turning out to be very positive forces within the military. They have military background. They do have some background problems that they have to deal with. For one thing, it is illegal in every southern state to learn to read and write as a black person. And so, as any of you who have been with the military at any time know, your biggest battle is paperwork in the military. And in this particular case, when you're first sergeant and none of your NCOs can read or write, or any of your senior NCOs, the regimental sergeant major or whatever, it was a very difficult situation for the officers of the time. And my talk on Sunday will be about the black chaplains and the educational programs that essentially were the forerunner of the Army's Operation Bootstraps and various other similar types of engagements for education within the other areas of the military. Most of the officers who will come into these black units are about 50 to 60% former Civil War officers who have been rewarded for A, their service to save the Union, and B, who's in the White House? Who's the dominant party? They're all good Republicans, so they get jobs. You know, you can't give everybody a postmastership or something, but you can give them a lieutenancy or what have you. And so several officers are rewarded. And of course, what do you got to do with all those extra young West Point guys coming out of the class of 1866, 67? Got to send them somewhere. So they send them to these regiments, including the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Almost every officer from 1866 through 1916 who serves with these black units are U.S. born. There are about 75 out of almost 1,000 men who are foreign born. Of that group of about 1,000, almost 400 eventually will be West Pointers as the Civil War fellows become older and start to look like me and can't get on a horse anymore, or like Benjamin Grierson, who we know is the commanding officer here, who was a cavalry officer who didn't like horses. But you know, it's a job. You got to do what you've got to do. The forces would come out here, but most are white officers, native born. Many are affluent, politically connected in the Republican Party. Grierson, who had been a school teacher, particularly in the field of music before the war, gets a colonelcy because he's become a Republican stalwart, and he's done some pretty good service in the Civil War. Many of you, if you can stand watching The Horse Soldiers with John Wayne, that's Benjamin Grierson in John Wayne's version of Benjamin Grierson. But at any rate, we find that the officers are coming from the Civil War veterans. Some of these Civil War veterans have been former enlisted men prior to the war or during the war, And one such individual who's our kind of central character tonight is Nicholas Merritt Nolan, who was born on March the 10th, 1835, and astoundingly, in Kilkenny, Ireland. There's no Irish in the army. Of course, how could he get in? The Irish need not apply. Well, literally, as we know, the Irish were looked down upon by especially the dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant society in America, and so they were at the low rung in many respects. So what's he do when he gets off the boat, fleeing the potato famine and all the troubles in Ireland? He enlists, like so many people before and after him, in the United States Army. And so, fleeing the great hunger, fleeing all the problems, this young 5'10" teenager becomes a private in the artillery. Now, the artillery is not a bad job, because they're defending Fort Hamilton, New York. Hardly ever attacked, except by, maybe a couple of drunken folks in town or whatever, start a brawl, but he's an artilleryman for a while. And he moves around thinking, oh, this is great. No, I'm in New York, there are a lot of people who look like me, and we'll get, go out and have a Guinness or something, Well, that doesn't work very long, because this is one of the rare artillery units that goes everywhere. They go to Maryland, they go to Florida, and you thought it might have been cold sometimes in Ireland. We're sending you to the Dakotas. Well, boy, that's a great fun thing, but it's time to think of a new job. So he transfers to Company K of the dashing old 2nd Dragoons. Now, the U.S. Army did not have cavalry till 1855. And matter of fact, some of the senior cavalry officers would be people like Robert E. Lee and Albert Sidney Johnston when we did form cavalry regiments. But in the old days, we had dragoons. And dragoons are kind of like mechanized infantry of their day. You arrive with a horse, you dismount, and you form a skirmish line, and you fight on foot. You're supposed to fight on foot and not die, but whatever. So he thinks, all right, I got a new job, this is great. So he gets to travel, and another nice posting, he gets to go to Utah in the 1850s with the dragoons, who are sent out there with about 1/4 of the United States Army to suppress the Church of Latter-day Saints from breaking away, in essence, and forming the state of Deseret, a totally separate nation on the far western side of the mountains and the prairies. And so he's with that unit. When the unit is recalled, the war breaks out, and the army is slightly expanded, the regular army. Most of the troops who will serve, as you all know, during the war are volunteer units, militiamen, the equivalent more of today's National Guard, actually, or Army Reserve. And at any rate, he makes it to first sergeant. With the fellow with no education, he's doing fairly well. He goes into a new regiment formed in the war, the 6th U.S. Cavalry, and in the 6th Cavalry, he rises in from sergeant to 2nd lieutenant, to 1st lieutenant fairly rapidly. He's in a couple of major battles. He even becomes a POW for a while, but he gets out, thank God he never has to go to Andersonville. Well, he's earned his chops by the end of the war, and so in 1866, when those regiments are formed, he's one of the guys standing in line saying, I fought for my new country, I helped preserve the Union, what about me? And so he gets one of the captaincies in the 12 troops of the 10th Cavalry, who are formed at Fort Leavenworth. And Fort Leavenworth is the traditional home of the 10th Cavalry, but they're treated with such disrespect there by the white post commander, who will not even allow the black troops to form in the same area as the white troops are. He sticks them in a godforsaken place on post, malaria-ridden swamps, for want of a better description, that Grierson, in his infinite wisdom, says, we got to get out of here. So they deploy to other places in Kansas, ultimately into Oklahoma, and ultimately into Texas. Why these officers will take these positions are everything from they had no other place to go, to some who were true believers in the equality of the black soldier, and that this experiment with the Army was the cutting edge of allowing blacks to have the dignity, the vote that blacks had earned, and through the various amendments to the Constitution abolishing slavery, the early Civil Rights Acts, that this was one of the places where blacks could find a home, and white officers, who were sometimes the successors to the abolitionists for many respects, could also perform. Nolan spends his first days, as soon as they leave Fort Leavenworth, in Kansas. And they go out to a place named Fort Larned, Kansas, which is one of the incredible national parks. It's worth a field trip with your students, I think, as a matter of fact. And Kansas is no longer dry, so you can have a beer. Very important to historians. If you don't understand that, we'll talk afterwards. But at any rate, they ride into Fort Larned on their bay mounts. The Army oftentimes tried to have each of their troops match blacks, bays, etc. The last troop, the M troop, usually got all the mixed horses. The band usually got white or gray horses. Kind of unit cohesion and building unit pride. I belong to Troop A, I belong to the band. And so they ride into the fort, but they're not the only ones there. The 3rd Infantry, a white unit, is stationed at the fort simultaneously. And soon the white soldiers and the black soldiers clash. Once again, the post commander there, like the post commander at Fort Leavenworth, assumes that the problem is with the African American soldiers. So he sends them out literally to the woodpile, not to be spanked, but not to live in their barracks, to live out in, as you know, Kansas. The winds blow in 4 directions simultaneously. I went to Kansas State, I can tell you it's true. And as a consequence, they're sent out to do all these menial tasks, and when they're out in these outer areas, they're also riding patrols and doing escort duty for the males and protecting the stagecoaches, which is ridiculous because they'll protect the stagecoach, they'll be dropped off, and they have to put it back to whatever fort they came from because we don't want black soldiers just riding. If they're not doing something to protect us, they need to go away. We've had our way, we've done with them. And so the troops have this clash. They've had a couple of combat missions in the meantime, and while they're at the fort on this detached duty, their stables burn. Now, it's probably arson, and it's probably the white troops, but there's no way to this day. It's one of the cold cases, as we would call it today. So what does the Army do? Not only are the horses burned alive, all the gear, ammunition, because these stables are some of the first buildings built at the fort that are secure, and as a consequence, they keep all their important stuff there. Well, it must have been the fault of the commanding officer of the black troops. So we are going to hold a court of inquiry, and this is wonderful. We decide that the contents of that stable, and God knows how they arrive at this, is precisely $5,085.93. And somebody has to take care of government property. Captain Nolan, you are in charge, you pay for it. Nolan makes less than $150 a month. Do the math. He'll be dead before he can pay off this. So for years, he's going to fight this situation that his troops are accused of this, and he's responsible for what has happened. Luckily, they will depart the fort. They'll go to another fort, Fort Zero, further out in Kansas. In the meantime, Nolan is called back to Washington, D.C., and to add to his woes, he has to answer allegations that he is mistreating his troops. So they're getting him both ways, because once again, the Irish are looked down upon almost as much as the black soldiers who served with him. So finally, they will leave Kansas. They'll come to today's Oklahoma, Indian Territory, Camp Supply. They'll be scattered out. They'll perform duties, and ultimately, by the 1870s, they're here in Texas at Fort Concho. Nolan's with his company, Company A again, he's here. He becomes somewhat of a favorite of Colonel Grierson. He and Grierson get along quite well. He's quite an affable fellow. He has a lovely wife. Grierson refers to him as a very fine and soldier-like individual. He's distinguished. He has an overhanging mustache, which, you know, cavalry guys have to have mustaches. They make us shave now in the military. What a tragedy. We can't have the big mustaches anymore. Another senior officer, Colonel Pecos Bill Shafter, who served with black troops, the USCT during the war, Medal of Honor recipient, shares a high opinion of Nolan, and so he takes Nolan and Nolan's troops out on a summer campaign against the Comanches in 1875, and at first, Nolan's part of the expedition seems to draw favorable press. Captain Nolan goes out on a scout. He's on detached service. The newspapers are saying he destroyed 74 lodges, and as you know, destroying 74 lodges is wiping out an entire village, essentially, which leaves them destitute. Once you have their hearth and their home and their horses, the Comanches are not the fierce lords of the plains. And so he essentially does fairly diligent work, but he lets the Comanches loose. And so when the Comanches escape, he goes from Shafter's glowing young cavalry officer to somebody who's in the doghouse and who's essentially sent back in disgrace back to the fort. And it will take him years. He's branded as someone that Shafter doesn't want with him. And this will have repercussions because now Shafter continues on the expedition in 1875 into essentially the same area that Nolan and his troops will ultimately go out to in another area. He escapes court-martial, fortunately. Grierson kind of intervenes with Shafter and says, you know, my guy, you know, we all make mistakes, and he quells things. But Shafter is unforgiving, and so Nolan says to himself, in essence, he's got to redeem himself. He's got to come up with some way to get back into good order, to be looked at as a positive force by his superior officers. We all have to get good OERs for advancement, et cetera, so to speak. Well, he draws the luck of the draw to the Llano Estacado, the Stake Plains, in 1877. They're sent out on an intelligence mission. Company A at the time, once again, leaves. And just as he's about ready to ride out, Nolan is one of these fellows that has a dark cloud following him. On February the 13th, his wife, Annie, dies of tuberculosis here at the fort. He's a widower. He has a young daughter, Katie, who is at a convent school in San Antonio, and his son, Ned or Eddie, living here. He's got to go get the daughter to tell her. He can't just send an Instagram or text her on the phone up in San Antonio that her mother has passed and she needs to come back to beautiful downtown Fort Concho. And so Annie, who's described as a refined, cultured woman from Washington, D.C., leaves this bereft family. The Griersons and others, the Coopers, who are officers here, Charles Lawrence Cooper and others, kind of rally around Nolan to take care of the family. There's some dispute who actually took care of the children, but be that as it may, he comes back to the fort, and immediately after he gets the children kind of settled in, the wife has been buried, he goes off on this expedition. So on July 10th, 1877, he heads out with Company A. His second in command, Lieutenant Cooper, whose daughter wrote some amazing material and is one of the more interesting looks at life in a frontier army through the lens of a child, but a very precocious child who eventually became a novelist in later life, will come out. He leaves the second lieutenant behind. The second lieutenant is fortunate that he's the only one essentially in the troop who stays here. There's not much in common between these officers other than Cooper and who's a native-born, relatively affluent society person, and this Irish upstart who came up from the ranks. But neither of them drank. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but if you ever look at records of Sutler's store and things, I can't believe that half the army wasn't killed by cirrhosis, not arrows. These guys were hard drinkers. Cooper is another man who's come out of the Civil War. He had been a private in the war in Company B of the 71st New York, and then he was an officer with the 127th U.S. Colored Volunteers. So he had had experience with black troops and found that a satisfactory situation to the degree that he was more than happy first to accept a lieutenancy in the 39th Infantry, and then when all that consolidation took place in 1869, he goes off to the 10th Cavalry. So Cooper, Nolan, and the men of Company A set out in this fatal foray. They have no knowledge of what they're going to encounter. They're heading towards the Stake Plains Horror, as it would be called by some of the newspaper accounts at that time. There'll be not only the 40 men and the 2 officers, but a group of white buffalo hunters that will go along and impart some of this tale piecemeal, and in some cases, accurately, and in other cases, not so much. Now, Cooper arguably will leave the best story behind in terms of probably the most terse prose and probably the most accurate. I mein, as they used to say, was you there? Well, we weren't, but we probably think that his letters home, because they weren't meant to be sent out to the public, gave a fairly good reflection of what happened. So his letter began that they are essentially go out to the waterless, sandy region of northwestern Texas. They're 4 days without water. It's bad enough for the men, but don't forget they're cavalrymen. They have horses, and the horses are suffering immensely. So Cooper opens his letter. He says, "Dear Father, you can hardly imagine our astonishment here to learn of the situation in the newspaper." This is after he's gotten back. He says, all these misfortunes that they've had, people are reporting them, and that's why he understands when they come back, everybody had given them up for dead. And indeed, they almost did die. Eventually, about 60 men would be in the party. They were sent out to protect settlers. They were sent out to find Comanches. They protected no one. They saw no Comanches. A Comanche will only be found if they want to be found. And certainly a bunch of fellows who, in many cases, have never been on a horse in a combat situation are not going to run down Quanah Parker and his people at any means. And so Nolan's command and company goes out. They have a fellow who's probably a former Comanchero as their guide. And, you know, Comancheros are the salt of the earth, so I'm sure this guy was the greatest guide you could have, you know, just because they were thieves and murderers and thugs. It doesn't really matter. He knows the territory. This has been an unusually dry year. And so, believe it or not, it gets dry in Texas. I know most of you will be astounded to hear that, but that did happen. And so they will not only go without water, but ultimately, even though they have food, they're so dehydrated, they can't even eat anything. And so they begin to kill their horses and drink the blood. That satisfies just about 3 minutes of thirst, and is actually some of the worst things you can do. You're better to do nothing than to drink blood. It's a physiologically, it's a terrible thing. And again, this will be one of the things that the doctor will point out. So they keep dropping out in numbers. Some will die, some will wander off, some will essentially desert and go back and look. And in this one case, Cooper says, our men had dropped back one by one, unable to keep up with us. Their tongues and their throats were swollen, and they were unable even to swallow their saliva. In fact, they had no saliva to swallow. And so they're absolutely getting out to there's, of course, you know, dehydration, when it does, they're exhausted, they're staggering, it's like they're drunk, because, of course, all their cognitive faculties are going. Their throats of the horses, they said, are being cut, the blood's distributed. It doesn't do anything, because this sodium and the potassium chlorides and things in blood, once again, draw fluid from the body. They don't place fluid into the body. They get the blind staggers. So they're out for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally, he said, on the 4th day without water, it was dreadful. A picture of the internal regions and the rich man begging for a drop of water to cool his tongue could not have been more fully portrayed as to his agony than it was to us during this eventful day. So the men are dying, the horses are dying, they're cursing, they're praying. Frankly, Nolan probably loses command and control. But then again, I probably would have lost command and control on day 1 rather than day 4, so he's tougher than I am. Ultimately, they will come back to a rendezvous point, and they will run into a rescue party at a place called Double Lake, where the relief party was sent from Fort Concho in search of them. Cooper concluded this, I suppose, will in a measure account for the statements in the Eastern press, because, again, they thought they were all dead. Some of the soldiers deserted and got back here. They would be court-martialed because they abandoned their fellow troops. One of the NCOs, frankly, just took command of some of his guys and said, if you want to survive, in essence, you should go with me. And so they make it back here. Some of these troops would be court-martialed, the ones who had deserted and come back and essentially reported, everybody's dead, we're the survivors. That was not true, so that part was definitely an issue. The newspaper accounts are, if you go on the Chronicles of the Library of Congress, Chronicles of America, you can plug in Nolan in the name, and all these newspaper accounts come up. This book is written in 1877, the Buffalo Soldier tragedy of 1877, a new book, but it talks about this older book written in 1877. Eventually, some of those soldiers who are given really harsh punishments because of the extenuating circumstances will not be executed, will not serve exceedingly long situations. In the meantime, now, the widower, Nolan, comes back. He escapes any ramifications of what had happened. He could have been held accountable because, after all, he was the commanding officer. And he's also, by this time, has met a young officer by the name of Henry O. Flipper, USMA class of 1877, first black graduate of West Point. Nolan, being an Irish Catholic, knows what it's like to be low on the rungs of the totem pole, or the ladder, and so he actually writes a couple of letters that are very complimentary of Flipper, and indeed, Flipper stays with the Nolan family prior to coming to Concho and prior to the death of his wife, Annie, and becomes kind of a household friend. You know, he's a subordinate officer, but in the Army, when you serve for 15 or 20 years with the same unit, because you don't get to be promoted out of your regiment until you're the senior captain in your regiment and the junior major in another regiment dies. So they all took what was called the Army and Navy Journal, to read not only about military tactics and stuff, but immediately to go to the obituaries and say, oh God, Jones is finally gone, I can become a captain or a major or whatever finally. So it was a pretty difficult time. They used to say your bar on your shoulder as a lieutenant would change to silver long after your hair had already done so. And so Flipper is an officer that respects Nolan, and Nolan respects him. They become close, and we know, of course, Flipper's part of his problem is he rides at Fort Davis with Nolan's sister-in-law, a white woman, because Nolan will remarry a San Antonio judge's daughter, and the other daughter, who's single, comes out, and a black officer, a black soldier with a white individual is not going to be acceptable for a white woman. And so part of his problem in his career is that interracial implications, and so no, he'll actually be court-martialed, but in fairness, he's court-martialed for conduct on becoming an officer, and unfortunately, it was true, and so his dismissal from the service was pretty much what every other officer who was held in court-martial for that. Incidentally, the second wife who he marries, the sister will come out. They have a third sister who will become one of the first women librarians at the Library of Congress. This is a very interesting family. Somebody's paying attention out there, I hope, for their master's thesis. So, at any rate, the situation will come that Nolan will be back in the saddle. He will help come in the rescue party when Grierson is attacked in the field during the campaigns against the Apaches at this point up at Eagle Springs, and he does good service. He actually is a good officer, but again, he was a good officer in a bad situation that probably no one could have pulled out. Ultimately, he's weathered all these storms. He's lost his first wife. He's almost been court-martialed a couple of times. He almost dies in the field. He's sustained himself in combat and shown himself as more than an adequate combat officer. And so finally, by seniority, as I mentioned, he's the senior captain in the U.S. Cavalry when one of the majorities in another regiment, in this case, the 6th Cavalry, which the old regiment he started with in the Civil War, dies. And he goes off to Arizona from Texas and becomes the commanding officer of Fort Huachuca, still an active Army installation today. His family remains behind. It's hard, you can't just PCS pick somebody up and throw them in the van and drive them, and they show up and move you as they do today. And frankly, women have no status in the Army anyway. There are only two kinds of women that have status in Army regulations: matrons in the hospital and laundresses. All other women are camp followers. You tell that to Colonel Gerson's wife, you might get an argument, but that's theoretically how they're looked upon. Because again, this is an Army that if they want you to have a family, they'll issue you one. So Nolan finally gets into Arizona, and he gets some good press and some bad press. But Arizona is notorious in its newspapers for a love-hate relationship with the military, especially during the Geronimo campaign, which this is by now, it's the 1880s. And so finally he gets a reprieve, and by the way, he comes and reports to the Fort Huachuca, and they have, by now, there's been 3 different changes in the models of U.S. Army saddles, the so-called McClone saddles. They have these outdated model 1869 saddles, and now it's the 1885 saddle. But someone can't account for them, so guess what? Nolan, you just reported you must have lost them. You're in charge here. You pay for those saddles. Like I say, Black Cloud. This was not Lucky Nolan. This was not his nickname. Anyway, he gets through that, and things happen. The press is beating him up a little bit in southern Arizona, and he gets a change of venue to Fort Apache, Arizona. Fort Apache is one of the few Native American reservations that the government didn't say, oh, this is so bad, we'll give it to the Native Americans. It's glorious. It's one of a few beautiful places. And so, wow, he's going to be up in the mountains and the trees, and a place where years before the famous Martha Summerhays had done as a young Army bride. And so he's off to Fort Apache. He can have his family come out now. They're going to come out on the train. The train has finally come through southern Arizona in 1882, and this is 1883. And so he goes to pick up his wife, his sister-in-law, and the children. And on the way, he probably has a brain aneurysm or a stroke, and he dies. So the wife and family show up, and there's no one there to meet them because their sponsor, as we would say today in the military, is dead. So in early November, the Army and Navy Journal, which is a wealth of information from everything from gossip to policy, wrote of him that he was a veteran and an efficient officer, whom the editor portrayed as a man of appearance and extremely popular with his associates, and the news of his sudden death will be received with sorrow by numerous friends in and out of the Army. Obituary in the Arizona paper was also much kinder to him in death than they had been in life. Charles Cooper, however, because of this expedition, will never speak to Nolan again. Cooper will go on, he'll rise in rank. His daughters, as say, will leave a memoir behind that she first has as a novel, thinly veiled, but ultimately the original manuscript has been published of her childhood memories of this fort and other places, and of her remembrances of the black soldiers and some of the friendships that developed between the black soldiers and their white families and officers, including when Edith Gerson dies. The coffin will be made by one of the black soldiers who will, in retirement, be one of the 4 who will retire to San Angelo and buried in your cemetery. And so Flipper will remember fondly years later Nolan, however, because Nolan treated him with the dignity and the respect of an officer and a gentleman, which he was. And so till essentially Flipper's final day, he respected Nolan, a fellow officer who looked upon him as an equal, not as an inferior. So we will have, Nolan will be buried in the San Antonio Cemetery. It's the fairly closest cemetery during his death. His wife, his second wife, however, will be left at age 24 as a widow with a 14-year-old stepdaughter, and we all know how delightful 14-year-olds are, and the invalid stepson. And so with no property and $25 a month military death benefit, live on $25 a month, even in 1883, you can't do it. Eggs were some places $1 an egg, which is actually cheaper than today, but not much. Finally, the 54th Congress will be magnificent and say, oh, we'll double it, we'll make it $50 a month. But she has a tough time all the way through her life. Interestingly, She's buried in Arlington Cemetery under a headstone that says, Annie E. Dyer, died July 11, 1907, widow of Major N. Nolan, 3rd U.S. Cavalry. So this brings us to the end of this somewhat convoluted story. But there's many names here that you'll recognize. Again, Grierson, Flipper, Nolan, not so much so, even Cooper. But what I'm wanting to say is that we have great facilities here. Not everything is online, and believe it or not, not everything on Wikipedia is true. So you may want to do your own research somewhere else. But the Fort Concho people are building a brand new research center. They inherited the library of the finest historian on the black military experience in the West, or actually one of the finest too, because the other historian who's named Schubert, his collection is in Kansas City, and they have good ribs, so you might want to research there. But the 50 boxes of materials on the black military experience, plus an incredible library, are now here at Fort Concho being processed. There are many graduate papers or undergraduate papers on the soldiers, on their lives, on their impact on the local community, and vice versa. And chiefly, thank goodness somebody's doing this, we know so little about the women. And yet, as they say, behind every successful man is an astonished woman. And so in this particular case, the women of the Frontier Army are imperative to the story. Goldsby, his wife, will be here. Her story, why Hollywood comes up with the junk they put on, I have no idea. The real stories of these men and women who face racism, who face hardships that no one today could ever fathom. Oh, the electricity went out, so big deal. We go crazy. The wine's going to get warm in the refrigerator, which actually is a tragedy, but that's another story. So I really invite the students here to keep an eye on the progress of the new structure, because there's material that needs to be brought out to the public, and not in just papers that you'll do. I found a master's thesis from 1950 on Buffalo Soldiers that was brilliant before anybody had ever heard the term Buffalo Soldiers, never was published. Don't let that happen. Publish, get them in journals, get them online, not on Wikipedia, but get them online in good venues with the Park Service and others. This story is not black history, it's not military history, it's American history. Thank you very much.